It started with a simple request for water, but when a flight attendant refused to serve a black man, things took an unexpected turn. What happened next shocked everyone on board, and the consequences were bigger than anyone could have imagined. Stay with us, because in just 5 minutes this flight would go from routine to unforgettable. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The plane had just leveled off after takeoff, and the flight seemed to be on track for a smooth journey. Passengers settled into their seats, some with books in hand, others watching movies on their screens. The hum of the engines was a familiar background noise as the flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Among the passengers, Marcus sat in first class, looking out the window, his posture calm and composed. He had just finished a long week of meetings and was now looking forward to a few hours of peace before landing at his destination. Marcus, a black man in his early 30s, was used to flying frequently for business, but today something felt off. The flight was quiet and the passengers around him didn't seem to be causing any issues. But as he glanced around, he noticed the flight attendant, Karen, walking down the aisle, her gaze briefly meeting his. He had seen her before on other flights, but today there was something different. She didn't smile at him like she did with the other first-class passengers. Instead, she just walked past him, not even acknowledging him. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this kind of coldness in the air, but he chose to ignore it, focusing instead on his work. A few minutes later, he decided it was time to grab a glass of water. It wasn't much, just a small request, but it was enough to stir things up. Marcus pressed the call button and waited. When Karen finally reached his seat, she had a forced smile on her face, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her tone more clipped than usual. "I just need some water, please," Marcus replied politely, trying to keep things light. He was tired, and the dryness in his throat was starting to annoy him. Karen nodded but didn't move immediately. She glanced at him briefly, then at the rest of the cabin. "I'll be right with you," she said, before moving on to another passenger without another word. Marcus was taken aback but didn't make a scene. He had seen flight attendants delay service before, especially on busy flights, but something about the way Karen had brushed him off felt different. He glanced around again, noticing that the other passengers, especially the ones who weren't black, were being served without any delays. It wasn't a big thing, just a glass of water, but something about the interaction nagged at him. He had been polite. There had been no reason for her to treat him that way. After a few more minutes of waiting, Marcus pressed the call button again. This time, Karen turned to face him with an even colder expression. "Yes?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I asked for some water earlier," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Could you bring it to me now?" Karen's expression tightened, and she gave him a look that was hard to read. "You'll need to wait," she replied curtly, her tone bordering on dismissive. She started walking away again, her back to him. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His request had been simple, and he hadn't been rude. He wasn't sure if Karen was having a bad day or if there was something more to it, but the delay was beginning to feel intentional. He sat back in his seat, trying to ignore the frustration building inside of him. But it wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about respect. He wasn't going to let this slide. As Karen passed by again, Marcus caught her eye. He stood up, his voice steady but clear. "Excuse me, but I've been waiting for my water for a while now," he said. "Can you bring it to me, please?" Karen stopped in her tracks, a faint frown appearing on her face. For a moment, she looked as though she might say something, but instead she just muttered, "I'll get to you when I can," and continued down the aisle, ignoring him completely. Marcus took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. He had been polite. He had been patient. But now he felt humiliated, as if his request didn't matter, as if he didn't matter. He sat back down, keeping his eyes on Karen as she moved toward the back of the plane. The other passengers were still talking and relaxing, unaware of what had just happened. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The minutes seemed to drag on as Marcus sat there stewing in silence. His frustration was growing, but he kept his cool. He didn't want to cause a scene, but there was something about this situation that felt off. The rest of the passengers were still talking, some chatting quietly, others on their phones, but the tension in the air around Marcus was palpable now. His request for a simple glass of water had been ignored twice, and each time Karen walked past, it felt like an insult. Marcus was no stranger to microaggressions. He had experienced his fair share of subtle biases in his professional and personal life. But this felt different. He wasn't just being ignored. He was being dismissed as if he didn't even deserve basic courtesy. And for what? Because of the color of his skin? The thought unsettled him, but he wasn't about to let it slide. As he sat there, the silence in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. The flight attendants continued their rounds, but Karen wasn't approaching his seat anymore. It was as if she had deliberately chosen to avoid him. The other passengers were beginning to notice, some of them stealing quick glances at him and then at Karen, unsure of what was happening but sensing that something was wrong. A few minutes later, Karen came down the aisle again, this time with a drink cart. She passed by Marcus without so much as a glance, continuing to serve other passengers. It wasn't until she reached the last row that Marcus stood up, taking a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. "Excuse me, Karen," he called out, his voice steady but firm. Karen paused for a moment, then turned around. Her face was tight with annoyance, but she didn't say anything. The rest of the passengers watched with bated breath. "I've asked for some water twice now," Marcus said, his voice calm but unmistakably authoritative. "Could you please bring it to me?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened as she glanced around the cabin, her gaze moving from Marcus to the other passengers, some of whom were now watching the interaction. There was an awkward silence, the kind of silence that made everyone feel like they were witnessing something they shouldn't. "Look," Karen said, her voice lowering slightly. "You're not the only person on this flight. I'll get to you when I get to you. There's no need to make this a big deal." Marcus's patience snapped. "It's not about being a big deal," he said, his tone rising a little. "It's about treating people with basic respect. I've been sitting here quietly, waiting, and now you're refusing to do something as simple as bring me some water." Karen's face flushed, a mixture of irritation and something darker flickering in her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm just doing my job. You're not the only person on this flight, so stop acting like you're entitled to anything more than anyone else." The words stung, but Marcus remained calm. He didn't want to escalate things further, but it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the water. This was something deeper, something about power, race, and the way some people thought they could treat others. At that moment, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers were now actively listening, some leaning forward in their seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. They could all sense that something was off. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't let it rattle him. He was used to this, people watching, people judging, people waiting for something to happen. But this time, he wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen. "Karen," he said again, his voice firm but measured. "I don't know what's going on here, but I don't deserve to be treated this way. I'm a paying customer, and I've asked for water just like anyone else. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect." Karen stood there for a moment, her jaw clenched, staring at him. The air between them crackled with tension. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the back of the plane, her steps faster now, almost as if she was trying to avoid him altogether. Marcus sat down again, but the anger and disappointment inside him were hard to contain. He couldn't believe this was happening. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. The rest of the passengers, still watching the interaction, slowly turned their attention back to their own conversations. But the mood in the cabin had shifted. Some whispered among themselves, others pretended not to notice. But Marcus knew what was happening. They saw what had just transpired, and something told him that the ripple effect of this moment was far from over. The flight continued without incident, or so it seemed. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the window, trying to regain some calm. The seatbelt sign had been off for a while now, and people had settled into their routines, but he couldn't shake the unease building inside him. His earlier encounter with Karen wasn't just a minor issue anymore. It had become something more significant. The quiet anger that had simmered during the flight began to burn hotter as he realized what had happened. Karen had ignored him, twice. She had dismissed his polite request for something so simple as water, and the way she treated him felt deliberate. He had done everything right, been polite, patient, understanding, but nothing mattered to her. It wasn't just a bad day for her. It felt like she was making a point, sending some sort of message. But what was it? And why him? As the minutes ticked by, Marcus knew he couldn't just let this go. It wasn't about the water anymore. It was about respect. It was about the principle that people, regardless of their race or background, should be treated with the same courtesy and dignity. He wasn't going to let this small incident slide, especially when it felt like it was happening because of who he was. He pulled out his phone and started typing a quick message to someone he trusted. Marcus had connections at the airline, not just through business but personal ones too. He had worked with people at all levels of the company, and his name carried weight. He wasn't going to make a scene, not here and now, but he was going to make sure the right people knew what was happening. He hit send, and within seconds, a response came back. It was clear and to the point. "We're aware. We'll handle it." Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it was brief. He wasn't sure exactly what the airline would do, but he trusted them to take action. His role now was simple: stay composed and wait. It wasn't about revenge or getting back at Karen. It was about accountability. Whatever happened next, he knew that the situation would be addressed in the right way. But what exactly would that mean for Karen? As the flight went on, Karen continued with her duties. She seemed to move through the cabin more hurriedly now, her previous calm demeanor replaced with a tense, almost nervous energy. She wasn't making eye contact with Marcus anymore. In fact, she avoided his section of the cabin entirely, serving the other passengers with mechanical efficiency. But the damage had already been done. The whispers among the passengers started to grow louder. Some of them had witnessed the earlier exchange, while others had seen the way Karen had behaved afterward. And now, there was a noticeable shift. A few passengers near Marcus leaned forward, subtly checking in with him. One older man, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned around and caught his eye. He gave Marcus a sympathetic look, shaking his head slightly. "Everything all right?" the man asked quietly. Marcus, still calm, nodded. "Just waiting for my water." The man smiled faintly, though there was an edge of discomfort in his voice. "Yeah, I saw that earlier. You deserve better treatment than that." Marcus appreciated the gesture, but he didn't want to make a scene. "Thank you," he said simply, turning his attention back to the window. The last thing he wanted was to draw more attention to himself, but he was now painfully aware that everyone around him was watching. By this point, Karen had begun to serve drinks again, but there was something about her movements that didn't seem quite right. She seemed distracted, almost jittery, like she was aware of something she didn't want to face. Every time she passed by Marcus, she didn't meet his gaze. She just moved quickly, her eyes fixed ahead, avoiding eye contact altogether. It was only when the flight attendant, Susan, approached Marcus's seat to check on him that the mood shifted again. Susan had been quiet throughout the flight, but had treated Marcus with the respect he deserved from the moment he boarded. She smiled warmly, her demeanor open and polite. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone genuine. Marcus looked up at her, relieved by her kindness. "Water, please," he replied, his voice calm but carrying a hint of the frustration he still felt. Susan nodded and moved off, but as she did, she cast a quick glance back toward Karen, who was now standing near the galley. Karen's back was to them, but her shoulders were tense, as if she could sense what was happening, even if she wasn't fully aware of Marcus's next move. As Marcus watched Susan leave, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had been patient. He had been polite. But at what point did patience become passivity? He wasn't someone who typically stirred up trouble, but this wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, for what everyone deserved. This was about more than a glass of water. It was about dignity. And he wasn't about to let it slide. When Susan returned with the water, Marcus took it from her gratefully, his mind already moving forward. He knew that by the end of this flight, things were going to change. The question was, how much longer would it take for Karen to realize the mistake she had made? As the flight cruised on, the tension in the cabin lingered, thick and uncomfortable. Marcus sat back in his seat, sipping his water, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His hands still felt tight, his chest heavy with the lingering frustration. But now, it wasn't just about his personal discomfort. It was about something bigger, something that had to be addressed. Karen, meanwhile, continued her rounds, though now her movements were even more tense. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that was impossible to ignore. She moved swiftly down the aisle, serving drinks and snacks to the other passengers, but her eyes never once met Marcus's. Each time she passed, there was an undeniable shift in the air. The passengers around Marcus, who had previously been absorbed in their own worlds, now watched the interactions with more awareness. Some exchanged looks, others whispered quietly to each other. Marcus could feel the weight of their gazes, but he remained still, not wanting to escalate things further. He wasn't trying to cause drama, but there was a simmering anger inside him that he couldn't shake. The injustice of it all kept running through his mind, how Karen had treated him, how she had refused to serve him simply because of who he was. It wasn't just a bad moment. It was a reminder of how easily people dismissed others, how readily they let their biases slip through. As the plane neared its halfway point, Marcus saw Karen pass by once again. This time she stopped and glanced at him for a split second, just long enough for Marcus to catch the flash of guilt in her eyes. She quickly looked away and continued down the aisle, but something in her expression made him pause. For the first time since the incident began, Marcus wondered if she had realized the magnitude of her actions. Had she figured out that it wasn't just about the water, that it was about respect? He didn't have time to dwell on it though, because as the flight progressed, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The usual hum of quiet chatter and in-flight movies had been replaced by something more unsettling. The whispers had grown louder, and passengers were no longer simply observing. They were engaging. A woman seated 2 rows ahead of Marcus, who had been watching the whole interaction, leaned toward him and spoke quietly. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but concerned. "I saw what happened earlier." Marcus gave her a small, appreciative smile. He wasn't sure how much to say to a stranger, but her concern felt genuine. "It's fine," he replied softly, trying to brush it off. "Just a misunderstanding." The woman didn't seem convinced though, and gave him a look that said she didn't believe it was just a misunderstanding. "I know what I saw," she said, lowering her voice, "and I don't think you should just let it go. Not after everything that's happened." Marcus was surprised by her words. He hadn't expected a passenger to step forward like this, but it seemed like he wasn't the only one who had noticed the shift in the air. Other passengers, too, had started to murmur among themselves. The uncomfortable tension was spreading throughout the cabin. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about the way people were treated, the way some passengers thought they had the right to make others feel small or unimportant. Marcus felt that the eyes of the cabin had turned toward him, watching, waiting to see how things would unfold. And as much as he wanted to ignore the situation, he knew deep down that this moment wasn't going to end quietly. It wasn't going to end with just a glass of water. This had become something much more serious. Minutes later, the captain's voice came through the intercom, a calm and measured tone that did little to reassure anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he began, the words carrying a sense of finality. We are aware of the situation that has occurred during the flight. Please remain seated and calm. We are taking immediate steps to address the issue, and we will provide further information shortly." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Marcus sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected the captain to address the issue over the intercom. But there it was, an official acknowledgement. And that wasn't something small. The announcement was a signal that things were about to change, and they were going to change fast. Karen, who had been walking down the aisle with the drink cart, froze when she heard the captain's voice. She looked around quickly, her eyes scanning the cabin as if trying to figure out what had just happened. The passengers, who had been whispering quietly until then, grew silent. All eyes were now on Karen, their gazes heavy with judgment. And for the first time since the incident, Karen seemed to realize just how serious things had become. She stopped in her tracks, her face blanching as she slowly turned back toward the galley. The weight of the captain's announcement seemed to hit her all at once. Whatever she had done, whatever mistakes she had made, they were now being addressed by the airline's higher-ups. There was no going back now. Marcus couldn't help but watch her, a strange mix of emotions flooding through him. He had never wanted to see someone lose their job. That wasn't his intention. But he knew that sometimes things had to be addressed in a way that was uncomfortable, even painful, for everyone involved. The system had failed. People had failed him. And now, the consequences were unfolding. He glanced around the cabin again, and this time, the passengers' eyes weren't filled with sympathy. They weren't watching him anymore. They were watching her. Karen had become the center of attention, and the murmurs that had once been directed at Marcus now shifted toward her. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone on board knew that something big was about to happen. Karen moved toward the galley, but the steps she took were slow and hesitant. She knew what was coming. She had to know. And Marcus, with his calm but unshakable composure, knew that it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart for her. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The once steady rhythm of the flight now seemed fractured, like the calm before a storm. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, still clutching his glass of water, but his mind was racing. The captain's announcement had been the first sign that something was changing. The tension in the air was no longer just about his request for water. It was about accountability, and the way that simple moment had revealed a deeper issue. Karen had disappeared into the galley, her face a mask of disbelief and panic. But the rest of the cabin, the passengers who had been quietly observing, were now more awake than ever. Whispers grew louder and glances were exchanged as if everyone knew what was happening but didn't quite know how to react. It was one of those moments when time seemed to slow down, and the weight of every action felt amplified. Marcus wasn't sure what the airline was going to do, but he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him now. He had known, from the moment Karen had refused to serve him, that something had to be done. It wasn't just about being treated fairly. It was about the power dynamic that had been at play. The way Karen had acted, with such entitlement, as if she had the right to dismiss him, to ignore him. He couldn't let that slide, not when he knew that things like this happened every day, in small ways that went unnoticed. As the flight continued, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from the person at the airline's corporate office, someone he had worked with for years. He had explained the situation briefly in his earlier message, and now it seemed they were responding. The message was short but clear. "We've been informed. Preparing action. Stay calm." The words settled over Marcus like a weight, but it wasn't a burden he minded carrying. He had done the right thing. He had made the right call. Still, he couldn't help but wonder about the consequences for Karen. She had been harsh, dismissive, and now, it seemed, her actions were about to come back on her in ways she hadn't expected. A few minutes passed, and the overhead compartments above him creaked as passengers started to stir. The mood in the cabin had shifted. Some passengers, like the woman who had spoken to him earlier, were still glancing over their shoulders at Karen's absence. Others had simply gone back to their in-flight entertainment. But there was an underlying unease in the air. People were waiting to see how this would unfold. Karen emerged from the galley after a few minutes, her hands trembling as she straightened her uniform. She moved down the aisle more cautiously this time, eyes down, her earlier composure shattered. The air between her and Marcus had thickened, and the divide between them was now undeniable. Her earlier coldness was gone, replaced by an awkward unease. She glanced at him briefly, but there was no apology in her eyes, no sign of recognition. She just kept walking, trying to avoid making any more waves. But then, just as Karen passed by, the cabin door opened at the front. The flight deck crew had arrived, 2 senior employees, both in sharp uniforms. The change in their demeanor was immediate. They didn't belong to the normal crew rotation. These were people with authority, the kind of employees who dealt with matters much bigger than drink service. They walked past Marcus, ignoring him entirely, but it was clear they were headed straight for Karen. The whispers started again, but now the passengers weren't just whispering about the awkwardness of the situation. They were watching, their attention focused on the 2 men approaching Karen, who had now frozen in place, her back stiff as they closed the distance. The men didn't say anything to the other passengers, but the atmosphere grew colder as they stopped in front of Karen, their faces unreadable. "Karen," one of the men said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We've been informed that there's been a situation. We need you to step aside." Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time since Marcus had spoken up, her mask of control slipped. "What? What do you mean, step aside?" Her voice was strained, and her hands were shaking as she instinctively reached for her work tablet, as if she could somehow fix the situation with paperwork. The man didn't reply immediately. He just nodded to the other crew member, who stood silently, eyes locked on Karen. It was clear now, this was more than just a routine issue. This was something bigger. The first officer looked back at the rest of the passengers, then turned to Karen again. "Please follow us," he said, his tone unyielding. "The airline has already been informed of the situation, and they are taking immediate action. You will need to meet with corporate when we land." Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the words. But there was nothing she could say. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her, and the passengers could see it. She was being removed from her position, in front of everyone, no longer in control. The crew members gestured for her to move toward the back of the plane. Marcus sat frozen for a moment, watching it all unfold. He had expected action, but seeing it happen so publicly, so decisively, made his stomach tighten. He wasn't glad to see someone lose their job, not exactly, but Karen's actions had been more than just an oversight. They had been a statement, and now, that statement was being corrected. As Karen passed by Marcus's row, she looked at him one last time, her expression unreadable, though her eyes were filled with a mix of regret and frustration. But it was too late for apologies. The damage had already been done, and now, the consequences were in motion. The other passengers watched, their eyes following Karen as she disappeared into the galley, escorted by the flight attendants. A few exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others looking on in silence. But the air in the cabin had changed for good. The power dynamic that had been so clear just moments ago, her dismissive attitude, the way she treated Marcus as less than worthy of respect, was now completely reversed. And that reversal was something no one could ignore. The flight continued, but the passengers were no longer the same. Some were in shock, others relieved, but all of them now shared an understanding that things weren't always as they seemed. And as for Marcus, he leaned back in his seat, watching the unfolding events with a quiet satisfaction. Whatever happened next, he knew the airline was finally taking responsibility. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about accountability, about making sure something like this never happened again. As the plane continued its steady journey through the sky, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. What had started as a small personal moment of tension had now escalated into something larger, and the passengers could feel it. It was as if the air had thickened with the weight of the situation, and everyone aboard knew that this flight would be remembered for far more than its destination. Marcus sat in his seat, his fingers gripping the armrests, but there was a sense of calm about him now. His heart rate had slowed, and his mind, though still buzzing with the events unfolding, was more composed. He wasn't looking for drama, and he wasn't looking for conflict. But sometimes situations like this demanded action, and in this case, he had acted. Karen, the flight attendant, was now out of sight, escorted to the back of the plane where she was likely being told what had already been decided, her fate. A few minutes later, the two senior airline employees who had removed her from her duties reappeared. They moved down the aisle without acknowledging the passengers, but their presence was enough to make everyone in the cabin fall silent. The tension hadn't quite left, but it had morphed. It was no longer about discomfort. It was about something more substantial. It was about the ripple effects of what had just happened. Marcus had quietly demanded respect, and now the airline was responding in kind, showing everyone that actions have consequences, especially when they involve basic decency and fairness. The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, and the crew had resumed their normal routine. But every now and then, Marcus caught the glance of a passenger who had witnessed what had happened. There were subtle nods, a few quiet words exchanged here and there. He could feel their silent support, but it wasn't the attention he wanted. In fact, he preferred the quiet. The less said, the better. However, there was still the matter of the airline's response. Marcus wasn't just a passive observer in this. He had played his part, and now he had to wait to see what would happen next. The captain's words had been a clear message. This situation was being addressed at the highest level. What did that mean? And what would the consequences be for Karen? He glanced around the cabin, noticing a few passengers looking back at him. They weren't staring with judgment, but there was a sort of unspoken recognition in their eyes. He wasn't sure whether it was out of respect for standing up in the face of a difficult situation, or just a sense of solidarity. Either way, it was clear that something had changed. And then, the unexpected happened. As Marcus looked up, he saw a woman from the flight crew approaching his seat. It wasn't Karen, but another attendant, someone he had never seen before. She moved with purpose, but also with a sense of hesitation. Her footsteps were deliberate, and there was a quiet unease about her. She stopped just a few feet away from Marcus and cleared her throat before speaking. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked softly. Marcus looked up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yes?" "I'm sorry for the earlier disruption," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something apologetic in her tone. "I know this isn't ideal, but we're here to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight. Please let me know if you need anything else." Marcus nodded, still processing the situation. He appreciated the gesture, but it also made him wonder just how much the crew knew, how aware they were of the growing tension in the cabin. He hadn't expected an apology from anyone else on board. The captain had addressed the issue, but the airline staff seemed to be working hard to smooth things over. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, not wanting to escalate anything further. He had no desire to make anyone feel uncomfortable, least of all the crew members who were simply following orders. The attendant smiled politely, though there was an edge of discomfort in her expression. She lingered for a moment, as if unsure of what to do next, before turning and walking away. But just as she passed Karen's seat at the front of the cabin, Marcus saw a change in the air once again. Karen's absence was now noticeable. She hadn't been seen since she was escorted off, but everyone could feel her absence in a way that was hard to ignore. Passengers had gone back to their usual activities, but there was an unspoken weight to the silence. And then, the flight attendant who had spoken to Marcus earlier reappeared at the back of the plane, holding a small piece of paper. She scanned the passengers quickly before walking back to where the senior crew members were standing. Marcus could feel his heart rate pick up again as she handed the paper to one of the men. The man read it quickly, his face unreadable, then nodded. Something was happening, and it was about to affect more than just Karen. Marcus had done his part, had made sure his voice was heard, but now the wheels were in motion. He knew that this was no longer just about what had happened on this flight. It was about something larger, about holding people accountable, about making sure that things like this didn't go unnoticed. The flight attendants had dispersed back into their routine, but there was something different now. The mood had changed. Even as the plane continued on its way to its destination, the passengers could feel that. Everyone knew that when they got off the plane, something was going to happen. And Marcus? He sat back in his seat, his thoughts racing as he prepared for the storm that was coming. What would the airline do? What would Karen face when they landed? And most importantly, how far would the ripple effect of this one moment stretch? It wasn't over yet. The last stretch of the flight seemed to drag on endlessly. The calm hum of the engines, the steady rhythm of the cabin crew moving through the aisles, all of it felt like the calm before the inevitable storm. Marcus sat back, his thoughts still swirling around everything that had happened. Karen's refusal to serve him, the quick response from the airline, and the growing tension that had swept through the passengers. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been set into motion, and soon the full weight of the situation would come crashing down. As the flight continued, the passengers who had been whispering among themselves earlier now fell into a more subdued silence. Some continued watching their screens or reading, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just the usual hum of a long flight. It felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. It was as if they were all on edge, knowing that what had unfolded earlier would likely have consequences, not just for Karen, but for the airline itself. Marcus's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at it quickly. A new message had come in. It was from the contact at the airline's corporate office, the one who had assured him earlier that the situation was being handled. "The situation is escalating. We're handling it internally. You'll be informed once we land." Marcus let out a quiet breath, his hands resting on the armrests as he considered the words. Escalating. The term hit him harder than he expected. He had known that what happened couldn't be brushed aside, but now it seemed like the situation was bigger than he had anticipated. Escalating meant that the airline wasn't just planning a simple resolution. It meant they were preparing to make a public statement. It meant they were about to take a stand. He stared out the window, watching the clouds roll by beneath him. The scenery outside was calm, almost serene, but inside things were far from peaceful. The flight was nearing its descent, the cabin lights dimming in preparation for landing. The last few minutes of the flight were filled with the usual announcements from the crew, urging passengers to fasten their seatbelts, ensure their trays were in the upright position, and return their seats to the proper position. But there was something about those final moments that felt different. The last time Marcus had flown, he hadn't even noticed these small things. The quiet hum of the cabin, the routine checks, the uneventful landing. But today, everything felt amplified. The passengers around him were still reading, still watching, but the quiet was thick with expectation. There was an unspoken awareness in the air now. Even the flight attendants, who had been walking down the aisles with their usual efficiency, seemed to be walking a little faster, their faces set in neutral expressions, as if they were bracing themselves for something. Then, just as the plane started its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. This time it wasn't the usual pleasantries about arrival time or thanks for flying with the airline. His tone was sharp, official, and the weight of his words carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and commanding, "we want to acknowledge the situation that occurred during the flight. Please remain in your seats, and we will be addressing the matter once we land." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. For the briefest moment, it was as if the entire plane held its breath. The passengers around Marcus exchanged quick glances, and a few nervous whispers rippled through the air. The captain's statement had been brief but firm. There would be action, and it would be taken once the plane touched down. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The captain wasn't just going to let the issue slide, and it seemed like the airline wasn't either. Whatever had happened to Karen, Whatever consequences were waiting for her, it was about to unfold in front of everyone on board. The tension was now almost unbearable. As the plane descended through the clouds, the world below growing clearer with each passing moment, Marcus couldn't help but feel a slight sense of relief. The end of the flight meant the end of the waiting. It meant the end of uncertainty. Whatever was coming, it was coming quickly now, and there would be no turning back. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a soft thud. Marcus felt the familiar shift as the plane slowed, taxied toward the gate. The usual rush of passengers gathering their belongings, the sound of seatbelts unbuckling, and the hum of overhead compartments opening filled the air. But for Marcus, the cabin felt eerily quiet. It was as if everyone was waiting for the moment when the doors would open, when the consequences of everything that had happened would finally come to light. Just as the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the cabin crew began to prepare for deplaning. The senior employees who had been involved in removing Karen earlier returned to the front of the cabin. They moved with purpose, no longer the quiet figures who had come aboard midway through the flight. Now they were more than just crew members. They were symbols of the airline's decision, and they were about to make the final move. Marcus stood up, gathering his things, but his movements were slow, deliberate. The passengers around him were still adjusting to the new atmosphere, still unsure of what would happen next. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen to Karen. Would she be escorted off the plane by security? Would there be a public apology to the passengers? Or, as he suspected, would the airline just handle it quietly and behind closed doors? But before he could think any further, the flight attendants made their way to the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with each other. The senior staff, who had been hovering near the galley, exchanged a quick glance, and the taller of the two nodded toward the back of the plane. And then it happened. One of the senior employees approached Marcus, standing just in front of his seat. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. The moment felt heavy, like everything had led up to this one exchange. "Mr. Hayes," the employee said, his tone respectful, "we will be handling the matter directly. Please remain in your seat for just a moment." The words hung in the air like a signal to the rest of the cabin that this was no ordinary incident. The weight of the situation had finally come full circle. Marcus nodded, sitting back down as the employee moved to the front of the plane, his eyes meeting Marcus's for just a moment before he turned away. Now it was clear. Something was going to happen, and the rest of the passengers would witness it. As the final checks for landing were made, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the plane began to slow as it taxied toward the gate. The usual bustle of passengers getting ready to deplane felt muted, as though everyone on board was holding their breath. The normal noise, the rustling of bags, the chatter, the clinking of drink carts, had faded into an uneasy quiet. Even the flight attendants, who had been busy making last-minute checks, moved in a way that suggested they were bracing for something. Marcus didn't need to look around to know that everyone was wondering what would happen next. They all knew there was more to this than just a delayed drink service. Karen's treatment of him, her refusal to serve him, the way she dismissed his simple request. It wasn't just a mistake or an accident. It had been a moment of judgment, one that went unchecked. But now, things were different. The plane finally came to a halt at the gate, and the engines hummed to a stop. The crew began the usual disembarking routine. But there was an edge to their movements now, an urgency that hadn't been there before. As Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt, he glanced around the cabin, catching the eye of a few passengers. There was no mistaking the silent acknowledgement in their expressions. They had all seen what had happened, and they were all aware that the next few minutes would determine how the airline would handle this. The senior crew members, who had been in the galley and near the cockpit, were now standing at the front of the plane, ready to escort Karen off. Marcus noticed their purposeful strides. They were no longer simply crew members doing their job. They were part of the airline's response, its attempt to correct a wrong that had been done in full view of the passengers. Marcus's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from the contact he had messaged earlier. "Karen's been removed. We'll make a public statement once everyone is deplaned." "Thank you for your patience." The words confirmed what he had already suspected. The airline was not taking this lightly. They were handling the situation swiftly, but they also wanted to manage it carefully, ensuring the right message was sent. Marcus felt a twinge of relief, but also a small knot of concern in his stomach. What would this mean for Karen? And what would it mean for the passengers who were about to witness something they likely hadn't expected when they boarded the plane? The plane's door finally opened, and the first few passengers stood up to retrieve their bags from the overhead compartments. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, watching as the senior crew members approached the back of the cabin. One of them, the taller of the two, glanced in his direction briefly but didn't say anything. His eyes lingered for a moment, acknowledging Marcus without a word. It was as if they were silently thanking him for the role he had played in this process, even if it had been indirect. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "Mr. Hayes," one of the senior employees said, approaching his seat as the last of the passengers began to filter out. "Please remain in your seat for a moment." Marcus nodded without hesitation. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about how the airline would navigate the fallout from the situation. The senior employee's presence signaled that something official was about to happen. He had been prepared for this. He had done the right thing. But now the aftermath was unfolding. As the cabin cleared, the senior crew member stepped aside, signaling for Marcus to exit the plane. But just as he stood up, the door to the cabin opened again. This time it was Karen, her face pale, her hands gripping her uniform as she walked slowly toward the front of the plane. The moment was painfully awkward, the quiet whispers of the remaining passengers creating a backdrop of tension that was impossible to ignore. Karen didn't look at anyone, not even Marcus. She simply walked past him, her eyes fixed straight ahead. But as she passed, there was a brief, almost imperceptible glance in his direction, a look that held a mixture of shame, frustration, and perhaps a hint of disbelief. She knew what was happening. She knew that her actions had led to this, and now the consequences were unavoidable. The senior crew member moved toward Karen, gently but firmly guiding her toward the exit. The passengers who remained in their seats exchanged glances, some of them watching with rapt attention, while others averted their eyes, not wanting to be part of the moment that was unfolding in front of them. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted again, and now it was clear. Karen's fate was sealed. The quiet mutterings of passengers grew louder as she was escorted off the plane, but there was no joy in it, only a sense of quiet relief that the airline was holding its employees accountable. Marcus watched as Karen disappeared into the corridor, the silence in the cabin now deafening. He felt no satisfaction in seeing her go. He hadn't wanted this to happen. He hadn't wanted her to lose her job. But he had known from the start that there had to be consequences for her actions. Her treatment of him had been unjust, and it had been a wake-up call, not just for her, but for everyone watching. As Marcus gathered his things and made his way toward the exit, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed, not just for him, but for the passengers around him, for Karen, and for the airline itself. In a small, quiet way, he had made a difference. He had stood up for what was right, and the ripple effect of that decision was now being felt. When Marcus finally stepped off the plane, he paused for a moment at the gate, taking a deep breath. The weight of everything that had happened hit him all at once. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that this moment, the small but significant act of standing up against mistreatment, would stay with him for a long time. And as the door to the terminal slid open in front of him, he couldn't shake the feeling that, in the end, the right thing had been done. The airline had acted swiftly, and while Karen's immediate fate had been sealed, the ripple effect of the moment would likely continue for much longer, reshaping how both employees and passengers alike viewed their role in ensuring that everyone, regardless of who they were, was treated with dignity and respect. The terminal was bustling with activity as Marcus walked through the gate, but his steps were measured, slow. The air outside was cool, the sounds of arriving passengers and overhead announcements blending with the quiet hum of the airport. But for Marcus, everything felt different now. There was a strange sense of closure, but also an unease that he couldn't shake. The flight had ended, but the events that had unfolded on board were still fresh in his mind. As he made his way through the terminal, he caught sight of a few of the passengers who had been seated around him. Their eyes met briefly, but there was no need for words. They all knew what had happened. The silent acknowledgement was enough. Marcus nodded to a few of them, his lips curling into a small smile. They had witnessed the same thing. They knew what it meant. They were all part of a moment in time that for some would be remembered as a lesson in respect and accountability. Marcus's phone buzzed once more, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was another message from his contact at the airline. "The statement has been prepared. Thank you for your understanding. Your support helped us act quickly." Marcus let out a slow breath. It was over. The airline had made its move, and while Karen's actions had led to a dramatic change in her life, Marcus knew that this was only a small part of a much larger issue. It wasn't just about the incident on the plane. It was about how this moment would serve as a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with fairness and respect. He put his phone away, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. It had been a difficult day, but one that had forced a system to change, even if only in a small way. As Marcus exited the terminal and walked toward the waiting taxi, he couldn't help but feel that despite everything, justice had been served. And in that quiet, decisive moment, Marcus knew that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a collective one that would ripple out, affecting more people than he could possibly imagine. Marcus stepped into the taxi, the cool evening air rushing in as the door slammed shut behind him. He leaned back against the seat, staring out the window at the city streets that began to blur into the background. The taxi rolled through the busy downtown area, the lights flashing by in a chaotic but rhythmic motion. As he gazed out at the city, his mind was still replaying the events from earlier in the day. It was all over now. Karen was off the plane, escorted by airline security. The passengers had seen her leave, their murmurs filling the cabin as they processed what had just happened. The airline had taken swift action, and although it felt like a significant moment, Marcus knew that the real work had only just begun. He thought about the message from the airline. "Statement prepared. Your support helped us act quickly." It felt hollow in some ways. Sure, the airline had acted quickly, but what about the larger issue? This wasn't just about one employee's mistake. It was a reflection of a system that allowed things like this to happen. Karen's actions weren't just an isolated incident. Her behavior had been a symptom of a deeper problem, one that needed more than just a swift response. It needed change. The taxi passed by a park, the lights illuminating the walkway where people were out enjoying the evening. It all felt so normal. The world continued, unaware of the small ripple Marcus had just caused. But to him, it was anything but small. What had happened on that plane was a wake-up call. It wasn't just about him, but about every passenger who had ever been treated unfairly because of assumptions, biases, or prejudices. And while today had been a step in the right direction, he knew that true change would require more than a single moment. It would take time, persistence, and most importantly, accountability. As the taxi wound its way through the city, Marcus's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, seeing a name he recognized. It was his old colleague, Jason, from the airline's corporate office. They had worked together on several projects in the past, but Marcus hadn't spoken to him in a while. "Hey Marcus, just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay. I know today was a lot. We're grateful for your calm in the situation. Things are moving fast and we're already making changes in response. I'll keep you updated. Thanks again for your support." Marcus felt a small sense of satisfaction reading the message. It was clear that the airline was taking this seriously, but part of him couldn't help but wonder what exactly those changes would be. Karen's immediate removal was just the first step, but would it be enough to address the deeper issues? Would the airline follow through on the promises they had made to foster a more respectful and inclusive environment for all passengers? The taxi turned down a quieter street, and Marcus could see his apartment building in the distance. He felt a weariness creeping over him, a mix of physical exhaustion and mental fatigue. It had been a long day, one filled with tension, frustration, and ultimately, action. But it wasn't just the events of the flight that weighed on him. It was the realization that the work was far from over. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of his building. Marcus paid the driver and stepped out onto the curb, the cool air brushing against his face as he took a deep breath. He felt the weight of everything that had happened settle in. But despite the exhaustion, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had stood up when it mattered. He had made sure his voice was heard, and in doing so, he had made a difference, however small it might seem. As Marcus walked toward his building, he wondered what kind of world he would be waking up to tomorrow. Would things be different? Would the changes promised by the airline make an impact? Or would it all fade into memory, as so many things often did? But no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. Today, things had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he had played a part in making sure that shift was for the better. The following morning, Marcus woke up early. The light streaming through the blinds cast long shadows across his apartment, the city outside already buzzing with life. It was another day, but it felt like everything had changed in the span of 24 hours. The events of the flight still weighed heavily on his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. He had tried to relax the night before, but it had been hard. There were too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns. What would happen to Karen? What would the airline do to address the systemic issues that had been exposed? It wasn't enough to simply remove one employee. It was about changing the culture. Marcus had no illusions about the complexities of the situation, but he hoped, truly hoped, that today would mark the beginning of something real. Marcus had a meeting scheduled for the afternoon, a follow-up on a project he had been working on for a few weeks. But even as he prepared for that, his mind kept returning to the flight, to Karen, to the moment when he had stood up for what was right. It had been a small act, but it felt like a turning point, not just for him, but for the people who had witnessed it. Would they remember it the same way? Would they carry that sense of accountability with them? His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a news alert. He unlocked his phone, expecting it to be more updates about the situation with the airline. But this time, it was something different. A headline caught his eye. Airline issues statement on controversial incident involving passenger and flight attendant. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the link, his eyes scanning the article quickly. The statement was clear. The airline had taken full responsibility for the incident. They had not only removed Karen from her position, but had also promised to implement new policies, including sensitivity training for all employees, a review of customer service protocols, and a commitment to fostering a more inclusive environment. The article went on to explain that the airline had reached out to Marcus directly, thanking him for his professionalism and patience during the incident. There was a mention of his calm and decisive action, though it didn't delve too deeply into the specifics of what had happened on the plane. Marcus set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. The relief he felt was immediate, but it was tempered with the realization that the job wasn't done. The airline had acted quickly, but the real test would come in the months ahead. Would these promises lead to real change, or would they be forgotten as soon as the next story took the spotlight? As he sat there, lost in thought, he realized that no matter what, the story wasn't just about him or Karen. It was about the system. And if this was the beginning of a larger shift, he would be ready to keep pushing, keep fighting for the kind of change that mattered, the kind that would last. Marcus got up and headed for the shower. Today was another day, but it felt like the start of something new. The day went by quickly, but Marcus found it hard to focus on anything other than the events of the past 24 hours. His meeting went well. He had always been good at compartmentalizing, but today, his mind kept drifting back to the situation on the plane. He couldn't help but think about the ripple effect it had created, the small but significant change he had been a part of. That evening, as he sat in his apartment scrolling through his phone, the news about the airline continued to dominate headlines. The statement they had released was being shared across social media, with many passengers who had been on the flight chiming in, sharing their thoughts. The feedback was mixed, but the overwhelming sentiment was one of support. People were talking about accountability, about how one person's actions had prompted a much-needed change. It wasn't just about the airline's apology or Karen's removal anymore. It was about the larger conversation that had started. People were questioning the way service was provided, the assumptions that were made about certain passengers, and how often these biases went unnoticed, or worse, were allowed to slide by without any consequences. The more Marcus read, the more he realized that his actions had sparked a dialogue far beyond what he could have imagined. A message popped up from Jason at the airline, a colleague who had been in touch with Marcus since the incident. Jason had been part of the team handling the aftermath. His message was brief, but meaningful. "Hey Marcus, just wanted to say thanks again for everything. It's not over yet, but this is a turning point. We've already started the internal review, and the response from the public has been huge. You made a difference. Don't underestimate that." Marcus smiled as he read it. It wasn't the kind of message that offered immediate solutions, but it acknowledged what had been accomplished. It was about more than just the moment on the plane. It was about the beginning of a larger shift, one that would take time, but would ultimately change how things were done. That night, as Marcus prepared for bed, he thought about the passengers who had witnessed the incident, the ones who had quietly stood in solidarity with him. He thought about the woman who had spoken up, the one who had leaned over and said, "You deserve better treatment than that." He had never expected someone to come to his defense, but in that moment, it had made all the difference. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about people seeing something wrong and refusing to stay silent. Marcus wasn't looking for recognition, but he knew that today had been a turning point. The airline's actions were a step forward, but the real challenge would come in the long term. The training programs, the reviews, the promises of better customer service, they would only work if everyone involved, from top management to the flight crew, truly embraced them. It couldn't just be a one-time change. It had to be sustained. As he lay in bed, the quiet of the night settling in around him, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had become part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't about the glass of water. It was about respect. It was about accountability. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful that real change could happen, even if it took time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. He had played a role in making sure that this moment, a small personal act of standing up, would be a step toward something better for everyone. And that, in itself, was enough. If you found this story interesting, be sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this.